Hello, hello, and welcome to Journey to SEA 2025. This is Shelley Edwards Barron, your creative writing specialist, here to talk about reports, narratives, and comprehension. Today is episode 5. Imagine that, 5 episodes in already. And what we'll be working on today, a couple of things. As always, for reports where we will begin, we're looking at the opinions and how to avoid them. So last week we looked at facts, how to identify them, and what it is students are supposed to be doing. And then this week we're going to look at how opinions can sneak into reports sometimes and ways that we can avoid them. And for the narratives, we would be looking at the conflict. Now, conflict is a big deal for stories. And it's something that many students really don't want to write about. You'd be surprised at why students don't want to write about conflict, but we'll get into that a little bit later. And then also, we'll be talking about comprehension. We're continuing with the issue of nonfiction. And today we're looking a little bit more closely at nonfiction questions, the kinds of questions that you would get for nonfiction, what may be unique, and we're looking at really understanding what questions are asking for. And that's something that students really need to look at, really understand what is the question asking them to do. So that's what we're into today. And for those of you who are new, to the live. Thank you for joining. Those of you who are returning, welcome back. And let's look forward to an awesome session today. Of course, ask your questions. You can WhatsApp me or send me questions in the chat. Let me give you my WhatsApp number. Um, just a reminder for those of you who might not know my WhatsApp contact information. Here's my number, 717-4993. So feel free to WhatsApp me if you have any questions. If I can, respond to it during the live, I will. If not, I'll hold it for next week and certainly try to answer as many questions as possible. All right. If you're on YouTube, you can send me messages there. They pop up as well. All right. Let's see. We're beginning with, yeah, I'm trying to do the whole sharing of slides a bit more because, okay, why are you doing this now? I prepped it and I was making sure that it worked properly. And now today, let's see. All right. Let's see how we're going. Yep, we're good to go. Yeah, all these technology issues. So I'm trying to go with some slides so that you'd be able to kind of follow through with the information and check back, just a couple notes to make things a little bit visual as well as auditory. So it's not just me talking all the time. All right, so we're avoiding sneaky opinions today. So, what do they look like? Now, when it comes to opinions in reports, most students, when you ask them, okay, what is a report and what kind of writing do you have in reports? And they would tell you, oh, for sure, avoiding opinions. They know this, but do they know what opinions actually look like in a report? And are they able to make sure they effectively avoid them? So the thing with what you're doing this week is making sure students really understand. Let me stop sharing this for a bit. Yeah, making sure students really understand what what an opinion in a report looks like, because that is something that they may not actually know. And for one thing, as I shared just now, we're looking at opinions coming in the form of adjectives, adverbs, and any mention of emotions. And emotions are things that, again, students know, okay, they don't want to talk about happy and sad and those kind of very clear emotions, but emotions can turn up in the words that we use. And this is why students really do need to be careful and pay attention to the language that they use in a report. So it's not just about, okay, you want formal words and, the big fancy words and so on, but we do have to pay attention to a couple of things. So in dealing with the idea of the report, yeah, sorry, I'm a little bit distracted. Just want to make sure I have this thing clear. Let's go back. Ah, there we go. Right. When it comes to the emotions kind of showing up in a report, it really does have to do with the different types of verbs that are used and how we use words to express the ideas. But we'll get to that in a little bit. Let's go to the types of adjectives. Now, this might be kind of fuzzy. I downloaded it just to, show all the different kinds, and these are like the typical ones. When it comes to adjectives, many times students don't recognize that adjectives can show up in many different ways. They think of, like colors and size and so on for specific kinds of adjectives, but there are lots of other kinds of adjectives that we do need to be careful of. So, definitely descriptive adjectives. Those are ones that really shouldn't come up in a report because this is a way an opinion shows up. Because if you're describing something, you are making a judgment, um, the ideas of, you don't want that in a report at all. And I have a comment, emotions can be hard, especially for people with autism. Absolutely, absolutely. And this is why we want to teach the students these things and not necessarily teach them in a way where they have to still always figure it out on their own. There are some things that we can tell them, this is good, use this one. This is not appropriate, don't use this one. And so, again, with students with autism, they really don't recognize emotions in others quite often. So what we can tell them, especially for a report, because in a report you don't want it, so don't use this word or this kind of word, and give them definitions and examples and so on. Um, Comparatives, you don't want comparatives in a report, because again, opinions. We don't want the, let's see, predicative, happy, tired. We don't want the compound. We don't want indefinite because reports have to be more specific. And so you can go through. The point is, when you're going through the adjectives, so you can say, hey, don't use these types of words because this word tells readers this. So it's not a matter of allowing the child or making the child figure it out on their own. We're actually telling, hey, this is an example. These are some examples. This is what it looks like. This is what you should not do. Do this instead. And so every time we share about this, we really are at this point giving information, giving examples, demonstrating, helping students recognize things. We're not testing at this stage. We're not questioning at this stage. We're giving information, we're laying the foundation because all of these things will be needed later on. And until a child is told or shared or shown or they have the experience, they're not going to understand it effectively. And so when we're going through this series, you'd notice that I do a lot of tell them this, show them this, demonstrate it, and then eventually we're going to start asking questions and asking the students to produce. Because, of course, we want to give them the materials that they will need and the strategies that they will need when they're asked to produce. And so even if they have to respond to something, it's just really a response that's general and you want them to be able to try it out. Yes, but eventually, because at this point, we're really just giving the information. All right, so this is with the adjectives. And then we have adverbs. So again, kind of fuzzy. This is just to show you the different kinds. We have different kinds of adverbs. Not all of them would be appropriate for a report. And so this is something that we want to make sure that students recognize which ones are good to use and appropriate and which ones would lead toward giving an opinion. So the minute we start talking how, because a lot of times, in a report, people say, well, okay, who, what, where, when, how, because the how is the process. The process, for process, we want details. We don't want, like, for example, specifically how a thing was done. We want the step by step process of the way it was done, which is slightly different from answering that question, how. And so, where could work. That's fine because in a report, we deal with location. When, yes, that is also appropriate, some of these, because we deal with time. How much? Not really. And how often? May or may not, depending on the situation. But if you look at answering the question of how often, that is an opinion, right? Um, there are other kinds of adverbs, and we really do want to pay attention to what information is the word giving? How is it giving this information? Those are the ideas that you want to pay attention to determine whether or not an opinion is going to be sneaking into the report. And then we also have the idea of a lot of students, when they think of interactions, they think of situations where there are people involved and people are responding. And when they think of responses to situations, there's a lot of emotional ideas associated with responses. And when there's a lot of emotional ideas associated with responses, we get the vivid verbs. And what makes a verb vivid has to do with the experience around the verb. And as I was saying, the word is, what the meaning is, that is where we get the emotions mixed into the verbs. And we call them vivid verbs because they do more than just tell us what happened. They kind of show us by infusing additional ideas into the concepts. So we end up with a word like, let's say, for example, rushed, and that is very different from proceeded toward, because in a report, all you want to do is to say, well, okay, participant went from point A to point B, and you're saying that they're going in that direction or they moved in that direction. That's it. That's all the report requires. To say that the person rushed or they did something quickly, all of those things have to do with our opinions and our judgment, our evaluation of the situation. And this is how words can show emotions and show greater impact than just the action. In a report, we really want to focus on the action, and we want to focus on paying attention to what information is coming to us with the language that we use and the words that we use. If there's any kind of emotional response, then maybe the language that we're using is not effective. All right. And so that is something that we want to pay attention to when it comes to the reports. So for this week, last week we looked at the facts. This week we're looking at how to avoid opinions. So we're starting with recognizing what an opinion can look like in a report. So maybe if the child has already been writing reports, maybe you can go through and see, okay, questions to ask. What words show emotions? What words explain things from an evaluation point of view? What words show judgment? What words show the ideas from the writer and not just the ideas given, what actually happened in the action. Because in writing we have two kinds of descriptions. We have the description of actions, and then we have like step by step, and then we have descriptions that show the experience behind the actions. And so in a report, you want the actions only, really, because you just want to know what happened. You don't necessarily want the experience behind the action, not this kind of report anyway. So it's not an evaluative judgment, it's not what do you think, it is what actually happened. So for this week, remember we're working with three sessions. First session, what does it look like in a report? Make sure they can understand what opinions can look like, how it can sneak into the report. In the second instance, second session, you want to look at, okay, now that you've recognized it and you know what it looks like, how can you change it? What do you do if you happen to put things in ideas like this? Do you just simply remove it? Because sometimes that's appropriate. Just take it out because it's not necessary. It could even be irrelevant information. Or do you change it? How do you modify your sentences to remove the opinion? Especially, this is something that will come in handy, and we're going to go this over again and again because let's say the student has written something and they're reviewing it and they say, "Ooh, look, I think this is an opinion here. I need to fix this." How do they fix it? So you can start laying the foundation for that right away. In the third session, which is a bit longer, what I would recommend is doing an activity and having students respond to the activity, make sentences and see which ones are opinions, which ones are straight up appropriate for reports. And then again, how to fix it if they do find that they have opinions, because you want to give them the opportunity to express themselves and see how they're writing and how opinions can actually show up for them. For some students, it's using the words quickly and certain other words that would show it up like that. For other students, it has to do with mentioning how teachers feel about a situation without stating that the teacher said it. They have their own ideas, and those kinds of things. This is how it could show up for different students. So we're recognizing what it looks like first, and we're doing some activities with that. Then we're looking at how to make those changes to remove the opinions. And then we're practicing with an activity that would allow students to really see and practice with creating language and writing sentences that do not have opinions. So that's the agenda for the report writing this week. And that's what we're working on, a continuation of the opinions, because you would be surprised at how often that is a problem in reports, especially when it comes to the descriptions and the real kind of narrative language sneaking in. It really makes a difference with how students approach reports. So it's something that is worth doing over and over. And even eventually later on in the year, we will always be touching on this because it's such a significant issue with report writing. So that's the agenda for the report writing. Let's move on to the narrative writing. And with narratives, what we're doing this week is we're moving into some details with the plot. So we looked at plot. I mentioned the 12-point plot development. And for those of you who are not familiar with the 12-point plot development, you can check back earlier episodes. You can reach out to me. I have lots of information on it to help students really get to that understanding of what plot is and how to make plot work. Now, rising action is one of the areas where students kind of fall short with plot, and part of it is because of the conflict and the reaction. We're going to be talking a lot about this consistently over the course of the time that we're discussing narratives, because rising action is a significant issue, especially how it's connected to climax. That's a big deal for stories because climax is kind of like, the high point of the story. So how do you get to that? Now, you get to that by creating conflict for the main character. And what is conflict? So, pretty much, conflict is anything that disrupts the main character from doing what they're doing. And I just realized I didn't type up the definition. So, maybe let me put that on screen. So, conflict, anything that interrupts the main character from attaining their goal. And these would be problems for the main character and anything that's distress for the main character, right? And so this is what we're considering as conflict, right? Anything that interrupts the main character from attaining their goal, and anything that creates a problem, and it has to feel distressing to the main character. If the main character is like, "Oh, whatever," then it could be conflict, but it wasn't developed effectively. So that's the thing with conflict. You can have conflict, but it's not developed effectively. You can have an issue, but the characters don't respond effectively. You can have an idea and then it happens to be solved too easily. So there are a few things to discuss with conflict. And so this week, as you're discussing conflict, then here's what you're paying attention to. You must have conflict. Excuse me. You must have conflict. And that might sound kind of like, of course, it must have conflict in a story. But the thing is, not all stories have conflict. Some stories are, just those feel good stories about, things happening nicely and we're relaying an experience. Not all stories have conflict. And I have had students, and more than one student, tell me that, they don't want to put conflict in the story because they don't want anything bad to happen to the main character. Yep. I've actually had students tell me that. They don't want to do anything bad to the main character, so they don't want to add conflict to the story. So, getting students to understand why conflict is necessary in this kind of story, and notice I'm stressing this kind of story, right? Why is conflict necessary? Because we need that rising action. Without conflict, there is no rising action. Because what rising action is, if we go by definition, in terms of understanding, all rising action is simply it's an increase in tension. And so it's an emotional development as readers go through the story, as the character experiences things. It's an emotional development. And that emotional development is in direct response to things happening to the character. Now, there's not going to be any emotional tension increase if there isn't anything happening negatively or anything that the character doesn't want to happen or they're trying to figure out. There isn't going to be any of that. And so, this is why conflict is absolutely necessary because characters have to react. And if they're not having anything that's challenging them, what are they actually reacting to? And so that's the issue. So we must have conflict, and this conflict needs to get worse before it gets better. So we're not talking about just one instance. We're talking about conflict increasing over time. And then finally, the conflict has to make sense to the story. And so there's a whole lot involved in conflict making sense to a story. Two of the main things would be, is the conflict that the character facing something logical for the situation? And then how the character is responding to it, is that logical for the situation as well? So when it comes to conflict, what you're paying attention to really is the idea that we must have conflict and go through that explanation as to why, the fact that conflict has to get worse before it gets better, and then the fact that conflict has to be relevant and make sense to a story. So for this week with narratives, what you're working on with students is to make sure that they understand these things, and you can also identify different types of conflict. There are actually different types of conflict, and the main ones that I think students would be interested in or that they can actually use for a story would be the like character versus nature. Then we have character versus self, like if the character is learning a lesson that improves their personality. We have character versus like science and technology, character versus another character, which would be like a villain. And so we're going to talk about these a little bit more, but you can start introducing the ideas from this week. So remember, just as with the reports, you want to have three touch points. I would say at least two if you can't manage the three, but you want to be able to review these concepts outside of just, writing. We want to have some discussions and some experiences. Now, there are a couple of experiments that I do with my class when we're talking about the conflict, and they we want activities that show students, things that like shock them or interest them, or things that move on, and you want um to do activities that show sequencing, like things like dominoes. That's like, if you can find nothing else, you have that domino effect where one conflict would tip another one and tip another one. You could even use that as an example, have them build something and then tip it over, and lots of, conflict relates to experiences and feelings. How do you react? And, lots and lots of things that we can discuss where conflict is concerned. For this week, this is kind of like the beginning of this discussion. You want students to know you must have conflict and they need to know why. So you could, read little stories like even the fairy tales. Fairy tales have conflict. I mean, Snow White was pretty much a villain with the queen who gave her the apple. Cinderella, yeah, wicked queen. And if you notice in all those stories, you can find the 12-point plot in there. We start off with context and then we go to conflict and then things get worse. So with Cinderella, like let's take Cinderella because that's like one of the more classic ones that easier to identify and analyze. So what's the conflict there? First off, remember the story began when her father remarried and then he died and she was left with the stepmother and two stepsisters. So the father dying changes things for her because that is like the first major thing. So you think that okay, maybe it's him marrying again, but that's not the issue. The issues began for Cinderella when her father passed. Then we have the way they treated her, things happening really negatively as a result of them being in charge and, not feeling like if she's worthy of anything. Then we have going to the ball. Everybody else is going. She can't go. So then the fairy godmother intervenes and we get some assistance. But then we have, midnight and then the slipper. And so it's a long story and there are lots of different issues. But you would see, even in stories like that, conflict increases before it gets better. And so that's what you want students to see. So, yes, there must be conflict because that kind of makes the story a lot more fun because then we get to see how the main character responds to the conflict. And then the conflict has to increase because then readers get to see how the main character responds to the increase in conflict. What do they do? And so on. That's what stories and exciting stories are about, how characters respond. So that's what you're going through this week. Why we need conflict, what it is, what it looks like in stories. So the first one, why we need conflict, what exactly conflict is, you're going with a definition. Second touch point, we want to explore different kinds of conflict. What do those different kinds of conflict look like in stories? Um, And then finally, you might want to like brainstorm, find a situation and see what different kinds of conflict you could come up with. So let's say you make a list of the different kinds of conflict and we go through that second session. Third session, what we're going to be doing is okay, here's a situation. What conflict could come up? And this is something that I am actually doing with my standard one and standard two students because even from at that level, students can understand how to brainstorm and come up with conflict. What is a conflict? What can it look like? Really simple things, like one activity that I did, I showed the student a photo of a child riding his bike, and then we started brainstorming what could be a problem for him riding his bike. He could get rushed by a dog, he could fall off his bike. Those are basic things, and then it could escalate. And so we're talking about how conflict shows up in a story. That's your main agenda, what it looks like. We're not testing yet, so we're not asking students to actually write anything or to prepare their own stories, but we're asking them to brainstorm and come up with ideas of how conflict can show up in a story. And so that's really what the focus is on this week. So all right, so what have we done so far? We've looked at reports. So, this week with reports, we're investigating the opinions, how they show up, how to get rid of them, what to do. With narratives, we're looking at what is conflict, where conflict comes from, and really just exploring this idea of, challenges and issues with the story, what characters can face. And then you want to kind of well, okay, so this is the beginning, but if you want to start introducing the ideas that some crazy things could happen too. So let's say, going back to that situation with the child riding his bike, being rushed by a dog or falling off his bike, those are all appropriate for realistic stories. But remember, we have fantasy, we have folklore, we have science fiction, we have action and adventure, and we have all different kinds of stories. So maybe even from now, you can start just, dropping the little hints. So, for example, he's riding his bike, and then maybe, a spaceship comes out of nowhere and beams him up. Different kind of story, but it's a conflict still. And so we can start, looking at those things, the different types of stories. What kind of conflict shows up in each of the different kinds of stories? And so this is something that I would do with my standard threes and standard fours because this is where they are at in their understanding. They may have already heard of the fact that you need problems in a story. They just don't know what they look like and what they can look like. With the standard ones and twos, we're sticking to the realistic things for now. I might here and there introduce some of the things, but their main focus would be what is conflict and what conflict could look like. Generally, it's a problem. And so there are lots of different things that you can do with the conflict. Like I said, I do lots of experiments, activities, just so students can have fun with the idea of conflict, how it shows up, and how it can escalate. Now, of course, we're going to be talking a lot more about that over time. And so you don't have to go into a whole lot of details now. Do what is manageable within the time that you've allocated. Your main agenda, if nothing else gets covered, you want to introduce that there must be conflict and what that is, problems, dramas, etc. We want to introduce that there are different kinds of conflict and what that could look like in a story. And then you want students to be able to generate their own ideas about conflict. So first we define, then we show what it looks like, and then we work together to brainstorm. So you're not just giving the student, okay, here's a prompt and you go do it. No, we're working together to brainstorm conflict so that where they might come up with like one or two, you should be able to fill in like two or three more so that they can see that there's a lot more to a situation than they might initially think. All right. So, like in that situation with the boy riding the bike, maybe he gets into trouble because he's not supposed to be riding his bike. He was told that he's, banned from riding his bike, and that could be an issue. There are lots of different ways to explore. Maybe the bike malfunctions. Maybe he decides to ride somewhere, and that riding of the place takes him on an adventure. So lots of different ways to explore conflict. And so, like I said, this is just the beginning. We will be talking about conflict over and over. So your main agenda this week is to make sure students understand what conflict is, how it shows up, and show them how they can create their own. All right. So that is it for the narratives and reports. We're done with that. Let's take a look at the comprehension. So, moving on to comprehension, this week we're looking at nonfiction questions. Remember, last week we discussed what nonfiction passages are, what they can look like, and the type of information that you get with nonfiction. So we introduced some of the questions and different things last week, and this week we want to go into that in a lot more detail. And so, in terms of the comprehension questions, my recommendation is that you go to the past papers because you really want to focus on the kinds of questions students will encounter. So you might choose maybe one past paper to go through. And if you're looking for nonfiction, then you want to go with, I think, 2019 and 2021. Those two are nonfiction, right? And so you're looking at what kinds of questions. And so not just the way the questions are phrased, because yes, that's some of the investigation that you're doing, but you're looking at what the question is actually asking for. So all comprehension has certain types of questions in common, but by the time we finished this series, you'd realize that there are some questions that are unique to certain types of texts. And one of the questions that is unique for comprehension for nonfiction is the main idea question. You might also get that important message question. What's the most important message in this, which is different from purpose, because you do get what is the purpose of this passage and what is the most important message. You can actually get both of them in an exam. I think the 2019 demonstrates that you can get both of them in one exam. But then, of course, you also have content questions. What do content questions for nonfiction look like? And so, identify, make a list, um, those types of things. What do the inferential questions look like for nonfiction? What do the evaluation questions look like for nonfiction? So we have those. Then we have vocabulary questions. And then we have meaning questions. So a phrase might be used. What is the meaning of this phrase? And then, of course, what the main idea, purpose, and important message. So you're really kind of studying questions this week. And so mainly that's so you want to go through the past papers. So maybe you want to spend one session going through the different kinds of questions that you identify in the 2019. Then the next session, just looking at the questions that you identify in the 2021, compare them, which, are they looking the same? We have 7 questions. Are they the same kinds of questions? How are they phrased? And so on. So you do get that as well. And then finally you want to look at the wording for the questions. What do words mean So, like, if you get a question, something like, what does this refer to? What does that mean? Refer, and those that phrase in the question. And so while you're doing all of that, remind the students that there is like three people. I think, remember, we there are three people in the whole equation. There's the Well, actually, there might be four. Let's work it through. So we have the person who wrote the comprehension passage, that's the author. Then we have the student who is reading it. Then we have the examiner who set the questions. And then we have the examiner who is marking the questions. With SEA, those are two different people. In many cases, they're the same, but with SEA, we have one group setting the assignment and setting the questions, and then another group marking it and grading it. And so, what exactly are they asking for? And then those who are grading it, what are they looking for in those answers? So that is where we're heading. And next week, we'll be talking about answering nonfiction questions. So we're going in a sequence. First, what is nonfiction? What does that look like in a passage? What kind of details can I get, and so on. Then we're looking at the questions, going into the details. What kinds of questions can I expect? When I read and I recognize, hey, this is nonfiction, I'm told this is nonfiction, then what should I expect? Where does my mind go? And, to prepare myself for answering these questions. That's what you're working on this week. And then next week, we're looking at answering those questions and how that is done effectively. So if you don't already have a copy of the past papers, get a copy. You can work with the blank ones for now because you're analyzing the questions, but definitely answer them, get yourself some answers. And I do have a copy of the past papers and the answers so that you can see how the questions are answered, and that kind of way in terms of preparation. I also, in the answers, in the answer worksheet that I gave, I also explain, okay, this question is asking this, and this is how you know this is what this question is asking, so that students can really understand how to interpret the questions based on how they are phrased. So go ahead and study the comprehension questions this week. Study the nonfiction comprehension questions, and what exactly is being asked. What would an answer for those questions look like? You can start that this week if you have the time, but we're definitely going to be working a lot more on that next week. So this week, let's see, what have we covered? And just a quick review of the major topics. So we looked at avoiding opinions, and with avoiding opinions, what are we doing? We're looking at adjectives, adverbs, and how emotions sneak in with the use of certain types of verbs. With conflict in stories, we're defining conflict, different kinds of conflict, and what it shows up like in stories. With nonfiction questions, we're looking at the different kinds of questions that come with a nonfiction comprehension passage and what the examiners are actually looking for when they ask certain types of questions, because there's a meaning question, there's a vocabulary question, um, there are detail questions, and actually, what is excellent if you get a copy of it. Let me see if I have the 2025 to 2028 assessment framework. This version of the assessment framework actually gives really, really nice breakdown, and it's easy to analyze. So let me share that as well. If you don't have a copy, get yourself a copy. You can go to the Ministry of Education's website, get yourself a copy, because this is going into effect from 2025, which is next year's exam. And I'm just going to scroll down and you see for comprehension. Now it has it for ELA and everything else. So definitely get a copy because you'll get information for math and the rest of the exam. But you'd notice something. So objectives for nonfiction and then objectives for literary texts. So stories and poems are considered literary texts. And then we have objectives for graphic texts. So it is actually separated. So when I was telling you that, hey, there are different kinds of texts, even the Ministry of Education has clearly outlined this, that there are different kinds of texts, and they don't just look at it generally as all comprehension. They have actually different objectives for each kind. And let me scroll down and show you just quickly what that would look like. I think we have to go to page like 13, right? So here we go. Objectives for graphics. This is what students are supposed to be able to do. Objectives for the fiction, poems and stories, and so on. And then all by itself, comprehension process for nonfiction. So these are the things that students are supposed to be able to do. And there's even a breakdown of the way the questions are asked. For nonfiction and fiction, you have 7 questions. 2 would be literal, 3 inferential, 2 evaluation or appreciation. So you get 13 marks altogether when you answer them, right? Poetry, same thing. Graphics, you have the different spreads. So having these kinds of documents really, really help you when it comes to understanding, because the Ministry of Education is trying their best for teachers and parents to understand what to expect and how to prepare students effectively. And so lots of these details are out there. And this is a document, Assessment Framework for the Secondary Entrance Assessment, Ministry of Education website. I think it's moe.gov.tt, and go to primary school resources and scan through there. You would get the past papers, you will get um, lots of other documents and resources that are quite helpful in helping you navigate this whole thing. So, specifically for the comprehension, we're going to page 13. It is in this booklet to understand the nonfiction and what is being tested exactly and how the questions are distributed. And then you want to work with the past papers to really show you what that looks like literally in the exam. So between those two, your child or your students should have that thorough understanding of each of the different types of comprehension texts that students will be exposed to. All right, so that is the end of this session today. Thank you so much for those of you who asked questions, who stuck around, who, took in the whole thing. If you're looking at the replay or the recording, thank you so much for your time. Please let me know how helpful it was, if it was helpful. If there are questions that you have that I was not able to answer during the live, WhatsApp me. I can certainly do my best to help you with understanding how to navigate these things. And in terms of resources, at the moment, what I have is the past papers with solutions to show you how the questions are answered. That WhatsApp me to get more information about that. You can also check my website under resources for purchase. Lots of information there. All right. If there's anything that you're looking for that you want to see that you haven't been able to find or you need more of, let me know. Send me a WhatsApp message. You can find me on Facebook as well. And I would see about working on creating these resources. Just hint, hint, I'm working on that poetry comprehension text that I mentioned, and that the aim is to have that done before the end of the year. Yes, it's a lot more slowly than I anticipated, but I am working on it. So you can look out for that soon. Okay. Thank you so much for your attention and your time. And I sincerely appreciate the feedback that I get. Just to let me know that, I'm on the right track and I'm sharing valuable details for you. All right. So have a good one. Enjoy the rest of your week, and I'll see you next week for more Journey to SCA 2025. Take care, everybody.